Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us across the fence. I'm Fran Stoddard. We begin today with a word of caution from the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. Spring's annual arrival is spurring the migration of reptiles and amphibians. So the department is reminding drivers to slow down and be cautious when traveling at night on roads near ponds and wetlands where salamanders and frogs will be on the move. To understand what's coming out of brumation, here's Vermont herpetologist Jim Andrews.
The amphibians have been spending the winter either underground below the frost line or right in the leaves where some of the species, 4 of our species, can actually just freeze and thaw, which is an amazing thing that their hearts can stop and their lungs can stop and they can freeze and then thaw out, just add water and a little heat, and then they have to head downhill to get to those pools and ponds and beaver dams to lay their eggs. So there's a big rush of those early breeders, wood frogs and spotted salamanders and Jefferson salamanders and blue spotted salamanders that all need to breed really early. It's an early sign of spring. It's kind of a rite of spring. It's an early passage. And sadly, for the amphibians, many times there's a road between where they're coming from and the pond that they're trying to get to. And if there's a lot of traffic on that road, there can be a fair amount of mortality. So people really like to get out and help them across the road and just see that early spring migration.
What's the process for tracking these migrations?
You look for these spots where there's good overwintering habitat on one side of the road, breeding habitat on the other, and you walk those sections of road at night, let's say 8:30 or so at night, maybe a half hour or so after sunset. You walk the roads, you may go up and down that particular crossage area with a nice, good, strong flashlight. I mean, even if people don't know the species they're seeing, that's still useful information. It tells us where a crossing area is. But even better is if they snap some photos. You know, I saw a few of these, I saw a few of these, I saw a few of these. You don't have to know what they are, but if people can get some photos and get them to us, then we can know what they are.
You can check the online Vermont Reptile and Amphibian Atlas to learn more about identification, migration, and breeding. You can also submit pictures and questions to the site. Go to vtherpatlas.org. This month marks the birthday of a Vermonter who was born into humble means but rose to the highest levels of American politics. Thaddeus Stevens was born April 4th, 1792. He's not as well known as Lincoln, Grant, and Douglas, who helped end slavery, but Stevens himself was among the leaders for freedom and the emancipation of slaves. Historian Howard Coffin takes us through the early years in the life of Thaddeus Stevens.
One of the things I like about American history is the variety of places where our famous people were born. It says a lot about the American dream. A Harriet Tubman in a slave cabin, Abraham Lincoln in a dirt floor cabin, a Roosevelt in a grand mansion, and Thaddeus Stevens here on a little Vermont farm in a small cabin where this cellar hole is today in Danville. Certainly the cellar hole is a lot bigger than the foundation of the place where Stevens was born. He was born to a poor family on the 4th of April, 1792. His father, Joshua Stevens, his mother, Sarah Morrill Stevens, didn't have much. The father was a farmer and a part-time cobbler, but he also was a drunk, and soon after his 4 sons were born, he disappeared, and Sarah was left to raise these 4 lads. Sarah soon knew that the boys were smart, particularly the oldest one, Thaddeus, and she knew that she was going to have to get him an education because he could go somewhere. When Thaddeus was about 10 years old, his mother Sarah sold the farm in Danville and moved to Peacham so the son could get a fine education. This is the house she bought, a mile from the village. and they lived here for several years. Sarah Stevens was known in this area as something of a saint. She went out to make house calls, to help people who were sick and injured. She was something of a visiting nurse, and people loved her, and young Thaddeus often went on those calls with her. He learned that people needed help. This would show in his later years when Thaddeus Stevens won the nationwide nickname of the Great Commoner. Thaddeus Stevens walked this road every day to the Caledonia Grammar School, better known as Peacham Academy. It was said of him when he was young that he had an overwhelming desire to learn. He had a clubbed foot, and it was a chore for him to make this walk. And when he reached school, he was kidded about his bad foot, but he persisted and became the star pupil of the school. These stones mark the site of the building where Thaddeus Stevens went to school in Peacham. He learned a lot of mathematics, literature, a little religion, and a lot of Latin. It prepared him well for college, UVM in Dartmouth. He also learned about the importance of education to people. And when he gets to Pennsylvania and gets involved in local and state politics, he becomes a powerful advocate for public education, for free education for all. And Pennsylvania moves ahead of much of the country in the area of education for all. Thaddeus Stevens made a lot of money as a lawyer in Pennsylvania, and of course he became chair of the House Ways and Means Committee during the Civil War, funding the Civil War and fighting always for rights for Black Americans. But his mind always remained very much back in Vermont, and he bought a house for his mother, this large white house on a hillside overlooking the village of Peacham. Thaddeus Stevens often came home to visit her here. Sarah Stevens died in 1854 here in Peacham. Her son came home for the funeral and stood by the grave as she was buried in this plot that he had bought for her. He erected this stone and paid for perpetual care in the cemetery. Thaddeus Stevens lived another 13 years, and in those years he became a leader with Lincoln in the fight to abolish slavery. When he died in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, he had this carved on his stone: "I repose in this quiet and secluded spot, not from any natural preference for solitude, but finding other cemeteries limited as to race by charter rules, I have chosen this, that I might illustrate in my death the principles which I advocated through a long life: equality of man before his Creator."
Thank you, Howard. Our final segment this afternoon signals the slow and sometimes imperceptible seasonal transition from winter to spring. Across the Fence's Keith Silva shares this photographic look at the end of winter. Enjoy, and thanks for joining us Across the Fence. I'm Fran Stoddard.